This would be the first iteration for the refugee flow map. And this was trying to show how the number of refugees from one country to another changes over time. It is a spectacularly poor job of doing so. The colors were correlated with volume, and while the change in the radius over time is supposed to show the acceleration or deceleration of the refugees, it just does a spectacularly poor job of showing you what's happening. Not to mention the fact that this is only one origin country, Afghanistan, with the refugees going out. It's not showing any other countries having refugees. So this was the next attempt. What this tries to do is represent every refugee as a dot. So in this case, this is all the refugees from Afghanistan and how they show up in Austria. You can see how as time changes, you can see new dots fade into the map. And then if we let this play long enough, one of the things we'll see that dots will also fade back out. The idea is that it's trying to represent how the flow of refugees changes over time. You know, that sometimes there are refugees coming from one country to another, and then at other points in time there aren't. It's just the way those kind of migrations work. What this map does a poor job of is that all the dots are randomly distributed within the country. And that random distribution actually looks like it's intentional. It looks like we're trying to visualize where refugees have shown up in a new country. And that's not what's happening at all. And it's actually potentially dangerous and damaging to do that, because you can create false impressions and tell a false story to people. And you don't want to distribute that kind of narrative that's that dangerously impaired. This iteration is now again showing the flow of refugees from one country to another. This time it's from Afghanistan to Germany. What's happening in this one is, again, every refugee is being represented as a single dot. We're showing a straight line path from Afghanistan to Germany. It's not super compelling. It's an improvement on the last one because it's going from the centroid of one country to the other country. So you can immediately tell we're not trying to convey to you any sense of settlement patterns or anything like that. And you can see flow. And the flow, I think, is the largest improvement from any of the other iterations of visualization. But it's just kind of sparking out in a ray gun sort of way, and it's not super awesome. And it's only for one country. This iteration, though, is mostly just a proof of concept, I think, that I could do one dot representing individuals in two different countries, right? Like saying this is the country where they start from, and that's the country where they end up in, whereas one of the previous iterations had been just the country they ended up in. So this version is a little bit different than the other ones. This one's not trying to do motion at all. Instead, what it's doing is it's trying to show in a straight line path all of the countries that we're going to visualize that have refugees leaving that country. This should be immediately apparent. The big problem with this visualization is that you can't tell what the direction of travel is. You don't know who's coming from where or who's leaving from where or anything like that. But that's kind of not the point of this. This wouldn't have even been considered as a final version. This was more just to see all the different paths and get a feel that what you're seeing and what you can show will still be compelling eventually. Kind of like an intentionally bad job or just a proof of concept for some of the engineering components that will eventually go into the visualization. So you can see points coming or leaving from Afghanistan, same thing for Iran, Iraq. You can see a lot of vectors arriving in Germany. You can see them spanning the Atlantic. You can see the refugees from Colombia. And it's also a way to test visually that the centroids that you're using for the countries are reasonable. And that's one of the other things you should kind of leap out right now, is that the centroid in the United States ends up in Montana instead of something that's more maybe in Iowa or Missouri, that's maybe more central to the continental United States. But the important takeaway from this visualization was that it was possible to identify and plot out all the different potential straight line paths from one country to another country. This version is still using just a simple straight line to show the path between countries, but what's happening now is it's animating over time. So you'll notice sometimes lines drop in, sometimes lines drop out. That's when the movement between those two countries for that year's worth of data, that's when it stops. So you'll see a line appear, you'll see a line disappear. That's what this is doing. This also wasn't intended as a final version. This was just, again, making sure that the idea of using these straight line interpolations between an origin and a destination would work, that technically I can draw the lines and that I can animate them over time. The other one that was light green with the white lines, it was really hard to see that there's poor contrast, and so when you looked at it immediately, it was tough to actually understand what you were looking at. This improves the contrast tremendously. This version is still using just a simple straight line to show the path between countries, but what's happening now is it's animating over time. So you'll notice sometimes lines drop in, sometimes lines drop out. That's when the movement between those two countries for that year's worth of data, that's when it stops. So you'll see a line appear, you'll see a line disappear. That's what this is doing. This also wasn't intended as a final version. This was just, again, making sure that the idea of using these straight line interpolations between an origin and a destination would work, that technically I can draw the lines and that I can animate them over time. The other one that was light green with the white lines, it was really hard to see that there's poor contrast, and so when you looked at it immediately, it was tough to actually understand what you were looking at. This improves the contrast tremendously. This is the current final version, but there'll probably be some more iteration on top of this. So this is taking the idea of one dot for every refugee at a given point in time, and it's taking the idea of animating that over time and space. You'll notice the centroids for the points, so you'll see the United States now makes more sense for where the center of the United States is. Same thing with the center of Russia. There's definitely a sense of motion as it animates, and I think that that's compelling and important. There's also, though, things are no longer animating strictly on a straight line basis. What happens now is that we've sort of, not arbitrarily, but we've chosen other control points, and instead of just animating along straight lines, we're now animating along curves. A particular kind of curve called a Bezier curve. It's a subset of a kind of curve known as splines, but it lets you draw them in a particular way. I don't have to give all the points along the path. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm giving it 3 points, and those 3 points are fed into a parametric equation, which is putting outputs where the point should be at a given time. So it's a nice way to animate a large amount of data over time in a very simple way, but also convey that sense of flow, that you can see things blossom out, you can see things bloom, and you can see like large numbers of these dots sort of spread out in different patterns, like both diffuse and also concentrated. But you'll see that when things are really concentrated right now, it's hard to tell when the lines are completely saturated which way the movement is. Like you can see that there's a lot of traffic between, say, Jordan and Iraq or Lebanon and Iraq, but just looking at it, it's tough to tell which direction that traffic's coming from. And that's an important part of the story, right? Like this traffic between Afghanistan and Pakistan, when it's saturated, you just can't tell right now, and that's something to work on, to use some type of visual metaphor to convey the direction of the motion.